Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing the 5 best trades in modern Sharks history, or I guess another way you could look at it is the 5 best trades in Doug Wilson's tenure as Sharks GM, which has been for almost 2 decades now, I believe 17 years, having taken over in 2003. And so the first one on this list, or I guess sort of the 5th place on this list, was a bit contentious for me, as there have been a lot of very solid trades made by Doug Wilson in his 17 years, at least you would hope, with a tenure that long. And so I had been considering, of course, the most recent one being the Erik Karlsson trade. It's hard to really evaluate whether or not this ends up being a very good trade or a very bad trade. It seems to be tipping the scales toward bad at this point, but who knows how Karlsson looks in the next couple of years. If he really does improve, he could find his way onto this top 5 list, but I just couldn't really justify putting it on now. The Evander Kane trade also comes to mind from the Buffalo Sabres. The Danny Heatley trade was one that I had also considered, but in the end I settled on this one. At the 2007 entry draft, the San Jose Sharks traded up just 4 spots in the first round from 13th overall to 9th overall so that they could draft Logan Couture. And of course, as we know now, Logan Couture has panned out to be an exceptional player for the San Jose Sharks, a very, very important player for them, a big playoff performer, the current captain of the San Jose Sharks, their current number 1 center, a 60 to 70 point player, 30 goal scorer. Logan Couture, as well as a defensive very defensive player, just a two-way player, 200-foot player, has panned out significantly for the Sharks. And what they ended up giving up, as I said, moving up 4 spots, they gave up that 13th overall that ended up being Lars Eller. They gave up a 2nd-round pick that ended up being Aaron Palushai, not really a big deal there. And of course, a 3rd-rounder that ended up being Ian Schultz. So they didn't give up much in terms of actual player quantity and actual player quality, I should say, and they got Logan Couture back. I'd say that is a pretty good deal for Doug Wilson. 4th on the list, it is the trade for Dan Boyle. This was one that I was hesitating between either 4th or 3rd, but I settled on 4th. The Sharks acquired Dan Boyle and Brad Lukowich from the Tampa Bay Lightning after he had been looking very good and had signed a new extension with the Lightning in exchange for Matt Carl, Ty Wishart, a 1st-round pick, which ended up being Kyle Palmieri. Though not drafted by the Lightning, this pick in fact bounced around a ton before finally settling with the Ducks, and then a 4th-rounder, which ended up being pretty insignificant. And as we know, Dan Boyle was a fantastic defenseman with the San Jose Sharks, was really the number 1 guy for the most of the time that he was with the team, especially at the turn of the decade, the 08-09 season, the 09-10 season, the 10-11 season. When you thought of San Jose, you thought of that intimidating offense that was led by Thornton, by Marleau, by Heatley for a couple of years, and of course by Dan Boyle on the back end. He was the power play quarterback. He was putting up 50, 60 points as a defenseman at a time where, defensive defensemen, you could say, were definitely more common. And so Dan Boyle really showing up there, right? A 50-point defenseman, 60-point defenseman during, the 1920 season isn't super impressive, but at the time it was kind of rare to see. So Dan Boyle really doing a great job and was just a fantastic number 1 guy for the Sharks for many years. The 3rd best trade, I ended up going with Martin Jones. As I said, I was hesitating between 3rd and 4th for the Jones and Boyle trade, but I settled Jones here for 3rd. During the 2015 offseason, or at the draft, actually, I should say, the Sharks had failed to make the playoffs. They were looking for a change. They dropped Antti Niemi, and they end up completing a bit of a interesting deal with the Boston Bruins and the Los Angeles Kings to end up stealing away Martin Jones from the Kings. The Kings, of course, would not trade that promising backup to the San Jose Sharks, but they ended up going to the Boston Bruins, who dealt with the Sharks themselves. They gave away their 1st-round pick, which was Trent Frederick in 2016, as well as Sean Kuraly. Neither of these players have been super impactful in the NHL, though Sean Kuraly is a pretty decent 3rd or 4th liner, but Martin Jones arrived and immediately made an impact with the Sharks, getting them not only through a very solid regular season, but to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time in franchise history, and that cannot go ignored. And this wasn't even a case where, let's say, 2010 Blackhawks, where the goaltender was sort of just along for the ride, but Martin Jones was an integral part of getting the Sharks to that Stanley Cup Finals. He was the best Shark during the Stanley Cup Finals versus the Pittsburgh Penguins, and so while he has fallen off in these past couple of years compared to someone like Dan Sam Boyle, who of course was consistently quite strong until maybe really old age or something like that. Martin Jones, you have to take the peak level, which was this Stanley Cup Finals, and who knows if the Sharks actually get that far without Jones backstopping them. So a lot of credit has to go to him, which is why I think this is the third best trade. Second, it is the Brent Burns trade. So the Sharks were able to acquire Brent Burns and a second round pick, which ended up being Pontus Aberg, though not drafted by the Sharks, in exchange for Devin Setoguchi, Charlie Coyle, as well as a first round pick, which ended up being Zach Phillips. Now, for the first few years of this trade, it was looking relatively even. While Devin Setoguchi had definitely fallen off a cliff since he became a Minnesota Wild, Charlie Coyle had developed into a pretty solid forward, third liner, definitely you could say second liner as well. And Brent Burns was a good defenseman with the Sharks, turned forward and then turned defenseman again. But Brent Burns really came into his own from the 15-16 season onward and really established himself as one of the best defensemen in the NHL. That 15-16 season finally being paired with a very solid partner for himself. Paul Martin put up, I believe, 75 points. The following year, 16-17, he won the James Norris, and he was a candidate for it in the following year as well. And while he wasn't a candidate in this past season, 19-20, he was still a pretty effective defenseman, at least offensive wise. And so not only has he been a great player for the Sharks, but he's also become a bit of an icon for San Jose. So Brent Burns certainly blossoming into a fantastic defenseman. And I think a big compliment that should go towards him, that even with the arrival of Erik Karlsson to the team, Brent Burns, you could say, maintained his spot as the number one defenseman for the Sharks. And there are very few teams that Erik Karlsson could have arrived to that had a number one defenseman and wouldn't immediately become the number one defenseman. So the fact that Brent Burns maintained that spot showed his capabilities and the trust that the Sharks had within him, which makes him the acquisition of him the second best trade from Doug Wilson's side. But number one is, of course, and I mean, I guess it's kind of close with Burns, but really not that close. It is the Joe Thornton trade, 2005. The Sharks trade Wayne Primo, Marco Sturm, and Brad Stewart to the Boston Bruins in exchange for first overall pick from 1997, Joe Thornton. And what does Thornton do that season? He goes on, he ends up having a productive last few months of the season with the San Jose Sharks, puts up 125 points, gets Jonathan Cheechoo of all players to 56 goals on the year, and wins both the Art Ross and the Hart Memorial with almost 100 assists. The following year, again, almost 100 assists, again, over 100 points. Joe Thornton, and that was just the beginning here of his career with the San Jose Sharks, and it just continued. He was an extremely productive player year in, year out, always right near the top in terms of points for the San Jose Sharks. As recently as the 15-16 season, where he was a point per game player, 82 points in 82 games at the age of 36. And even as he got older, 37, 38, he was still having rather productive seasons, only really falling off, getting to age 40 at this point. And this was the departure of Thornton to the Toronto Maple Leafs really prompted me to make this video and just made me realize, this Joe Thornton trade really shaped the future of the San Jose Sharks franchise when it was made. These past 15 years would not have been as successful as they were, even without a Stanley Cup, certainly. They would not have been as successful as they were without the arrival of Joe Thornton in 2005, and we must appreciate that as being not only the best trade thus far by Doug Wilson, but may go down as the best trade that he makes as Sharks GM, and potentially even in franchise history. I mean, I guess 10, 20, 30 years from now, that could definitely change. But at the moment, this Thornton trade just seems to reign supreme above the rest. And with how impactful Thornton was with the San Jose Sharks, it's hard to see much trumping that. But that will do it for this video. While there, of course, I am outlining the 5 best trades made by Doug Wilson, there are, of course, some bad ones in there as well. But of course, that is a story for another video. Class dismissed.